Frederick's victory at Leuthen in late 1757 did not solve all his problems, though it did allow Prussia to have a strong footing in Silesia and push the Austrians back to their territories. As Frederick wrote to his brother in January 1758, "If the coming year should be as cruel as that which has ended, I hope it will be the last one of my life." In the court of Vienna, despite taking heavy losses at Rossbach and Leuthen, both counts and the Empress Maria Theresa were still hell-bent on the destruction of Frederick. And this attitude was still shared by their two allies in Europe. Both King Louis XV and the Tsarina Elizabeth were still determined to end Frederick's reign in Prussia. On the Austrian front, Prince Charles of Lorraine was replaced by Marshal Count von Daun, the victor, as you might recall, the victor of Kolin. The war in Europe continued on several different fronts. Though the Swedes still hesitated to move into Pomerania, they would eventually move in there by February, but would quickly retreat once they encountered a small Prussian force. On the Russian front, the Russians were forced to regroup after their victory at Gross-Jagendorf. And after this logistics disaster, Tsarina Elizabeth fired the General Abercrombie, who was blamed for this, and replaced him with General William Fermor. And on the Hanoverian front, after the Duke of Cumberland was forced to surrender, King George appointed Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, Frederick's brother-in-law, who now took command of the joint Prussian, Hanoverian, and British forces. But unlike previous campaigns, Frederick would now try to move into Moravia, not Bohemia, as he had done previously. By May, Frederick and his army had moved into Moravia with sure footing. King Frederick's first objective was to take the city of Olmütz, where he hoped to drag the Austrians into battle and destroy them, just as he had at Leuthen. Frederick received a great deal of financial support from the British and Hanoverian crowns, as well as from Saxon merchants, which the Prussians forced payment from. Frederick's movement had hoped to drag Count Daun into a quick battle with him just outside the city of Olmütz. He planned to destroy him and then be able to move on to Vienna, where he could force the Austrians from the war once and for all. Frederick settled in to siege the town of Olmütz and to force Count von Daun to attempt a breakout. When on the afternoon of June 28th, the forces under Zieten were able to break away from the main Prussian force and settled in near the town of Domstall. On the morning of June 30th, 1758, Sestovics personally reconnoitered the Prussian convoy. He had two forest patches southeast of the road from Domstall to Odlieb, occupied by his Grenadier light troops and placed under the command of Colonel von Neufdorf to hold this road under fire at any moment. Meanwhile, General Zieten had hoped to complete his dispositions and approaches from Barn and were strongly secured. Around 9 a.m., the vanguard of the Prussian convoy under Major General Krakow, along with 400 wagons, passing by Domstall without noticing any Austrian force. Only 120 wagons had passed the defile when suddenly Stenstovik's corpse appeared on the wooded heights to the south of the road. and immediately opened a violent artillery fire against the entrance of the defiled Prussian troops. The Prussian vanguard repulsed at first the Austrian attack and got its sections of the carriages. 250 wagons hurried through. It then halted on the safe side of the pass to wait for General Zayton and his forces. General Zayton realized that the convoy could not advance any more as cannonballs smashed into the columns of wagons. After taking heavy losses, General Zayton then decided to launch an attack on the Austrian forces. He advanced against the Austrian left wing at the head of Grenadier Battalions Karlowitz. Meanwhile, the 2nd Garrison Regiment, Mustaphan, and the rest of the Prussian battalion attacked the northernmost forest patch, with Baron von Kaju's cavalry cuirassiers sent to reinforce the vanguard. Together with 400 men from Zayton's hussars and Warner's hussars, they now secured the approaches from Barn. Initially, the attack of the Prussian right wing proved quite successful, penetrating into the forest and dislodging the Warnster Grenadiers. The rain made muskets quite ineffective, and the hand-to-hand combat then ensued. Gradually, the Austrian left wing was giving ground, abandoning its guns. During the fight in the forest, the Prussian battalions became disorganized. Before they had time to reorganize themselves on the terrain beyond the forest, they were suddenly attacked on the left flank by the Austrian Colonel von Neufdorf, who had kept his cavalry concealed in the bushes, and suddenly charged the left flank of the Grenadiers near Doomstall. The shattered remains of this flank took refuge in Doomstall, where they were attacked by the Austrian infantry yet again. The supporting Prussian battalions were now separated from the wagons they were supposed to protect. The Prussian infantry then managed to redeploy not far from Doomstall, where Zayton then ceded command to Major von Roth and rode towards his left wing. Soon after 4 p.m., combat around Attelib ended. However, a few Prussian battalions still held their positions near Doomstall. Sestovics once more launched his left wing against them. The Prussians were soon attacked on all sides, and for the most part cut down or captured. Only few managed to escape through Doomstall and rejoin the main Prussian army. The Baron von Kaju's cavalry cuirassiers, who were still posted on the height of the southwest of Doomstall, did not care to come support the Prussian infantry. They rather followed the advance guard, who had meanwhile continued its march from Doomstall to Gayub to at least save the wagons transporting gold. The convoy was now a ruin, and the Austrians captured more than 3,000 loaded wagons. However, most wagons were damaged and unmovable. London burned everything that could not be transported and blew up the ammunition in this combat. The Prussians had lost 58 officers, 2,328 men killed, wounded or captured, 12 cannon, and more than 3,000 wagons. Major General George Ludwig von Puttkamer had been taken prisoner along with his 4 staff officers. And for the Austrian losses, they only lost around 600 men. The Battle of Doomstall turned out to be a great Prussian defeat, which gave the Austrians, under Count von Daun, a much-needed victory on the Moravian front. Of course, this loss at Doomstall did great damage to Prussian forces who were trying to besiege the town of Olmütz. And after Zayton's unit was destroyed at Doomstall, and the supplies coming in from Saxony were further destruction, on July 2nd, Frederick was now forced to retreat from the siege at Olmütz, and now forced to move back into Silesia.
Our apprentice Tom may now refuse to wipe his scoundrel mind.
Operations in Hanover had been conducted very poorly for the British in the year of 1757. The year ended in complete disaster. The critical development in what any measure was to be the worst string of disasters was Cumberland's capitulation on September 8th, 1757 to the French. Cumberland's army was trapped, and the Hanoverian army he commanded between the rivers Aller and Elbe, nearly encircled, with no prospect of reaching the sea, where the British Navy could resupply him. Cumberland had tried to make the best of an hopeless position by negotiating a surrender on terms that saved his army. The Convention of Klosterzeven showed the terms which were to be placed on the Duke of Cumberland. In December of 1757, the Duke of Cumberland was sacked after this failure at Klosterzeven and replaced by the brother-in-law of Frederick, the Prince of Brunswick, Ferdinand. Ferdinand, the Prince of Brunswick, I should better say. By February, Ferdinand had been able to remove a good deal of the French forces from the north of the Hanoverian electorate. By late February, the Hanoverian, Prussian, and British Allied forces began moving northward under the command of Prince Ferdinand. The Hanoverian army, led by Ferdinand's brother-in-law, the Duke of Brunswick, had driven the French, led by Comte de Clermont, as well as Louis de Bourbon, back across the Rhine. Ferdinand's own army had crossed the left bank of the Rhine and was now in a position to threaten the frontier of France itself. The forces crossed each other on June 12th at the Rheinsberg. A small battle ensued between the two forces around Rheinsberg, though the forces under Louis de Bourbon were able to escape the battle without suffering heavy damages. The French forces under Bourbon, who had recently replaced the Duke of Richelieu in command of the French army, was attempting to stem Ferdinand's advance, should he choose a defensive line on the south side of a walled canal running roughly east to west. Thus the walled canal constituted a sort of natural fortification that Bourbon thought would be easy to defend. Ferdinand planned to turn the French left wing at Anrath with the main body of his army. He initially intended to advance directly from Kempen against the left wing with the main body, while a weaker corps would demonstrate against the front. However, he was forced to abandon this plan. He decided to deploy at dawn on the height of Saint-Tonitz. Late in the evening of June 22nd, the Prince of Brunswick reported to Ferdinand about his reconnaissance mission sent the previous morning. Ferdinand then retired for a short sleep in his tent pitched in the midst of his troops. At 2 a.m. on June 23rd, Ferdinand assembled his generals and colonels in his tent. While the Allied army was making preparations for the battle, Ferdinand briefly informed his generals and colonels of the situation and of his plan for the day. Prince Ferdinand soon realized he was significantly outnumbered, his troops holding only 32,000 men, with his opponent, Louis de Bourbon, holding 47,000 men. At 6 a.m., Ferdinand reached the town of Saint-Tonitz and immediately climbed into the church steeple, accompanied by the hereditary Prince of Brunswick, the Lieutenant General Prince Holstein Gultorp. They inspected the French positions. After this inspection, Ferdinand gave his orders for the attack to be launched on the town of Crefeld. Bourbon, for his part, had nearly 8,000 troops set to defend the town of Crefeld in the center of his army, with the town of Anrath occupied to be used as a defense from the possible flanking maneuver. And of course, this was exactly what Prince Ferdinand had in mind. He intended to outflank his opponent to the left and began moving his army to the left side of his French counterpart, near the town of Anrath. This battle was conducted much in the style of Leuthen, if you remember that battle earlier. Louis de Bourbon assumed the attack would be taking place to his right and continued to reinforce this side of the battlefield, despite taking heavy losses on the left. A division under the command of Karl Wilhelm pushed the French forces to defend the city of Anrath. But it was the cavalry which successfully reached the back of Louis de Bourbon's lines and was able to inflict heavy losses on the French forces. With Karl Wilhelm's able to push back the troops in the center, the French lines in the center of the battlefield were in complete shambles. The French commander, Louis de Bourbon, was forced to order a quick retreat from the battlefield. The result had been a great victory for the Prussian and Hanoverian Allied troops. The Allied troops only lost around 1,600 men, with the French forces losing nearly 4,200 men. The Hanoverian front was now progressing well for the British and Prussian Allied troops, and this was a much-needed victory. In December of 1757, William Pitt fired Lord Loudon and had him replaced with Lord Abercrombie. This, of course, was a welcome sign to many of the colonial governors who disapproved of Lord Loudon's aggressive tactics toward the colonists. But Pitt's plans for 1758 were, in fact, not much different from Loudon's, in the sense that they could not be, for the geography of the eastern North America only gave but a few options for anyone who was contemplating an eruption into Canada, or the removal of the French force from the Ohio country. Lord Abercrombie's first objective at North America was to take Fort Ticonderoga, now held by French forces. Abercrombie's forces, of now 16,000 strong, left on July 5th, boarding their boats. Abercrombie's army's movement were delayed by Lord Howe's corps' slow movement. During this delay, this gave the Marquis de Montcalm extra time to prepare the defenses of his fort. On the morning of July 8th, Montcalm had only 3,526 men, including just 15 Indian auxiliaries, to defend the post and less than a week's supply of food. "Our situation is critical," wrote Montcalm's chief aide, Bougainville. "Action and audacity are our sole resources." On the morning of July 8th, a junior lieutenant was sent to inspect the British forces approaching the fort and give Montcalm the lay of the land. Montcalm did not order his field artillery forward from the landing place. He kept it where it remained. Gage's light infantry and Major Robert Ranger's companies and a battalion of Massachusetts light infantry moved up to the edge of the abyss, driving into the French pickets and taking up some sniping positions. Initially uncertain how to deal with the assault, Montcalm's forces withdrew behind the abattis constructed across the isthmus on which the fort lay. Montcalm set his whole force to strengthen the position overnight, building a nearly impenetrable thicket of branches and thorns. After an initial hesitation, Abercrombie resolved to attack, urged by Bradstreet. Lieutenant Clark, the Army's engineer, was sent to reconnoiter the French position. Clark advised that the abatis could not be stormed by infantry assaults alone. Soon after 9 a.m. on the 8th of July, the British and Americans began their frontal assault through the abatis. No use was made of the strong British artillery, and the attack continued throughout the day, with additional attempts to pass the fort by boat. In spite of the consecutive efforts of the American provincials and the British regular troops, the French held them back, until finally Abercrombie drew his men off, and the retreat began. The attacking troops suffered heavy casualties. In the final stages of the assault, the 42 Highlanders launched from the reserve a particularly determined attack that came near to succeeding, but was ultimately crushed by the French defenders. Montcalm rode back to Louis XV that he had claimed a crushing victory on the British troops. This, of course, was another great victory for the French in the Americas. The fortress of Louisbourg, on the Atlantic coast of the Cape Breton island, was the bastion guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River and access to French Canada. Before the British could conquer the French colony of Quebec, Louisbourg had to be recaptured. It had been taken by British provincial troops in the War of Jingansir, but was returned to France in the peace settlement of 1748. February 1758, Admiral Basquin's fleet carrying General Amherst's army sailed from Britain. 157 ships, 11,000 soldiers. On June 2, 1758, the fleet sailed into Gabarus Bay to the west of Louisbourg. There were 3 possible landing places. On June 8, 1758, the weather abated sufficiently for the attack to be made. Brigadier Generals Lawrence and Whitmore made feint moves against White Point and Flat Point, while Brigadier Wolfe attacked Freshwater Cove. General James Wolfe commanded all the grenadier companies from the regiments, a band of marksmen known as the Light Infantry, and Rangers and Highlanders. 3 boats with light infantry managed to land in the face of heavy fire and were reinforced. Round forces under the command of Geoffrey Amherst landed outside the city and began a siege operation, which in accordance with the standard of 18th century siege warfare meant digging a network of trenches surrounding the city. While Amherst's command toiled in the trenches, the British Navy remained concerned about the French ships defending the harbor. The only 5 French ships of the line remained by late July. They proved enough to menace to receive a considerable attention by way of British artillery fire. As a result, on July 21st, a cannonball penetrated one of those ships, detonating its powder magazine. The ensuing blaze was so hot that it set fire to the sails of the 2 neighboring ships, burning all 3 down to the waterline. On July 22nd, the King's Bastion, the key to the landward defenses of the city, burned under heavy fire from the British guns. 3 days later, on July 24th, Admiral Edwin Basquin, commander of all British vessels in North America, informed Amherst of his bold plan to capture the remaining 2 ships. Late in the night of July 25th and 26th, 2 squadrons under the command of Captains John Lefroy and General George Balfour, totaling approximately 600 sailors and marines, rode into the harbor, concealed by the dark and fog, and with Amherst ordering his artillery to fire into the works as much as possible to keep the enemy's attention to the land. The 2 squadrons slipped past the French battery guarding the entrance to the harbor and approached the 2 French vessels undetected. Amherst's battery opened fire on the fortress and began to batter down the walls. On July 26, 1758, the last French gun positioned on the wall was destroyed and a breach was made. On July 26, General Ducour, the French general, hoisted a flag of truce and asked for terms from the British. The well-learned etiquette of siegecraft gave him confidence that the British would grant his garrison the honors of war. Though the British looked for revenge from the horrible massacre from the years before, they often took no prisoner with regard to the Indians they crossed in their paths outside Fort Ticonderoga, and this was done with little disapproval from their commanders. Even the great General James Wolfe wrote of the incident, "Of the savages, I take them to be the most contemptible canaille upon the earth. Those to the southward are much braver and better men. These are a dastardly set of bloody rascals. We cut them to pieces whenever we found them, in return for 1,000 acts of cruelty and barbarity." After the failed sieges at Olmütz, Frederick was forced to abandon the siege and retreat through northern Bohemia into southwest Silesia, reaching Galatz on August 4th. He had to balance his resources because they were in very small supply. Also had to send a good deal of his troops to Pomerania to defend against another possible Swedish attack. The Austrian Marshal von Daun was following the retreating Prussians, although at a very slow pace. Saxony was held by only 20,000 Prussians, but the most immediate threat to the Prussian state was the Russian army of General Fermor, advancing from the east towards Kernitz on the Oder. The Russians were opposing by 26,000 Prussians under General Dohna. If Kustrin fell, the Russians had only 50 miles to march to reach Frederick's capital city of Berlin. Frederick resolved to march at a speed to attack Fermor with the aim of being back in southern Silesia to confront Daun within 3 weeks. Frederick marched on August 11, 1758, with 11,000 men to join Dohna and his Prussian army. Together, they would confront General Fermor and his 56,000 Russians. The Russians reached the Oder on August 15, 1758, and began bombardment of the town of Kustrin on the banks of the river Oder. Cossack and Russian troops pillaged the surrounding towns and villages. Frederick marched down the Oder to Frankfurt, arriving with his corps on August 20th, 1758. Lodging in the town, the Prussians could clearly hear the bombardment of Kustrin. As you might recall, Frederick had been imprisoned in the castle at Kustrin in his youth, when Frederick William beheaded his good friend to teach him a lesson. Early on the next morning, Frederick rode with his staff to meet General Dohna outside of Kustrin. Dohna's troops were in good order, but Frederick was far from pleased with the army's feeble attempts at resisting the Russians' advance. On hearing of Frederick's arrival, Fermor drew his army off from Kustrin to take up positions on the eastern side of the Oder. Frederick and his troops entered the town and found it devastated by Russian bombardment. The sight filled them with the determination to inflict revenge on the Russians. General Fermor sent a force of 11,000 men down the Oder, to the next major bridge, to prevent Frederick from crossing the river and attacking him. In doing so, Fermor completely underestimated the technical ability and determination of the Prussian army, and reduced his immediate force to 45,000 troops. The Prussian army wheeled to the west and marched to the line of Zorndorf before swinging to the north and began assaulting on the Russian rear. The Prussian assault began with its leading regiment on the new right of the Russian line, between the streams of the Zaberngrund and the Galgengrund. The Prussian advance guard, under Lieutenant General Manstein, began the assault on the far left, along the lines of the Zaberngrund. Manstein was followed by the left wing of the main Prussian army, under Lieutenant General Kanitz, moving up the right rear. Lieutenant General von Beberstein came to the support of Kanitz with his cavalry, as well as Lieutenant General Seiditz with his cavalry force, which moved up on the far side of the Zaberngrund, keeping it level with the advancing Prussian infantry. While this attack went in, Colonel Mahler's artillery fired a supporting barrage from positions around the burning village of Zorndorf. This village had been heavily pillaged by the Cossack troops and stripped of its resources. General Donna commanded the refused Prussian right wing, which remained stationary as the left wing pressed its attack. Artillery Commander Mahler moved his guns forward to fire his barrage from a shorter range. The noise of the battle was reported as stupefying, with Russian powder wagons exploding in the burning vegetation. In a lull in the racket, Frederick commented on the music being played by the band of one of his advancing regiments, and was told it was the hymn Ich bin ja hier in der Macht. Now, Lord, I am in thy keeping. And I again apologize for the poor German. Frederick hummed the melody as the regiment marched off into the dense smoke caused by heavy firing. Smoke proved a major difficulty for the Mantif's advancing infantry. The Russian line could not be seen until the Prussians were within 40 yards. The blast of musketry and canister from the waiting Russian foot and guns inflicted high casualties on Mantifer's battalions. Under pressure and unsure of its position, the Prussian advance guard drifted away from Zaberngrund, leaving its flank exposed to a charge by a force of Russian cavalry. In this devastating attack, some units suffering up to 60 to 70% casualty rates, the Prussian advance guard was driven back in full confusion. Kaunitz, not the other Kaunitz, was required to bring his regiment up in support of the advance guard, but failed to comply with the route taken by Mantifer, heading straight to his front. Passing the Steinbusch, several of Kaunitz's regiments began disorder. Emerging into the open, Kaunitz division met heavy fire of the Russian center and was attacked on its open left flank. Frederick and Prince Moritz brought up Beberstein's cavalry to lessen the pressure on Kaunitz's faltering advance. As bad as things had gone for the Prussians, it was at this point that Seiditz, the great Prussian cavalry commander, launched his decisive attack on the extreme left wing. Seiditz had been given the role of covering the Prussian left flank from the far side of the Zaberngrund with his 36 squadrons of cuirassiers and hussars. As the Prussian infantry assault became more admired, Frederick sent after the messages to Seyditz, ordering him to attack. Seyditz, though, refused to act on these messages, saying in one answer, "Tell the king that after the battle, my head is at his disposal, but until then, he will have to allow me to use it as I see fit." Finally, Seyditz considered that the moment had come to launch his major assault. His cavalry crossed the steep side of the Zaberngrund and formed a line at the gallop and launched a charge that swept away swaths of Russian infantry. The Russian right flank collapsed under the weight of Seiditz's attack. On the Prussian right, Donna's infantry moved forward to relieve the pressure on Kaunitz, but were counterattacked by General Dimoux's cavalry from the Russian far left wing. Around this time, Frederick seemed to have been struck with indecision by the way his plans were collapsing around him, but revived sufficiently to bring up cavalry regiments to relieve the hard-pressed infantry. Order began to break in both armies. Prussian hussars looting the Russian baggage, and the Russian soldiers breaking into open stores of alcohol. At around 9 p.m., the fighting ended. Donna's advance had pushed the Russians out of their positions so that the Prussians ended the day in the area of Kornstein to the rear of the original Russian position, while the Russians had been pushed towards the smoldering remains of the village of Zorndorf. The Battle of Zorndorf is often seen as a sort of draw. It's also one of the deadliest battles, if not the deadliest battle, of the entire war. Though Frederick was able to hold his position, he faced heavy losses, losing nearly 11,000 men, which is the most of the war so far, while his Russian counterpart, Fermor, lost around 16,000 men. Though the war continued to be deadlier and deadlier, it showed no signs of slowing down.